On the morning of August 21, 1942, at precisely 3:07 a.m., Private First Class Frank Pomeroy crouched in the damp coral sand at the mouth of Alligator Creek on Guadalcanal, his shoulders hunched behind the steel shield of a 37mm anti-tank gun that Marine instructors had never intended to be used this way. His hands gripping a stubby canister round filled not with armor-piercing steel, but with 122 hardened metal balls designed to scatter death like buckshot across open ground. And at 24 years old, a machine gunner from New England trained to punch holes through steel plating, Pomeroy now waited to fire a weapon that would instead punch holes through men, because only 45 yards away, across a narrow sandbar barely wider than a two-lane road, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was assembling 917 elite soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army for a bayonet charge meant to shatter the American perimeter and seize Henderson Field before dawn, and Ichiki's men, veterans of brutal campaigns in China, believed without hesitation that American Marines were undisciplined, soft, and spiritually weak, convinced by doctrine and indoctrination that superior willpower and a willingness to die for the Emperor could overcome any machine or bullet. But what Ichiki did not know as he massed his troops in the coconut groves east of the creek was that this narrow stretch of sand had already been transformed into a killing corridor measured not in courage but in mathematics. Because Pomeroy's gun commander had sighted the 37mm like a giant shotgun aimed at a doorway, pre-aligned to sweep the exact ground hundreds of screaming men would have to cross, and when fired, each canister round would burst apart just beyond the muzzle, hurling its steel payload forward at roughly 2,500 feet per second, reaching its target in 600ths of a second, faster than the human nervous system could react, faster than any man could duck, dodge, or reconsider, and as Pomeroy listened to voices murmuring in Japanese across the dark water and the faint clatter of equipment being readied for assault, he could not yet know that this obsolete anti-tank gun was about to teach the Imperial Japanese Army a lesson that would echo across the Pacific for the rest of the war, because tonight, on a forgotten stretch of beach, courage would collide with physics, and physics would win. Behind Pomeroy, stretched thin around Henderson Field like a broken necklace of foxholes and gun pits, more than 11,000 Marines waited in the humid darkness, their entire foothold in the Pacific hanging on improvised defenses built with captured shovels and whatever weapons the Navy had managed to unload before disaster struck at sea, because 2 weeks earlier, on August 7th, the landings at Guadalcanal had seemed almost easy, the Japanese garrison scattered and unprepared, Henderson Field captured by nightfall, but victory had soured within hours when Allied cruisers were destroyed at the Battle of Savo Island and the transport ships fled north, leaving the Marines with 5 days of rations, limited ammunition, and the knowledge that if their perimeter collapsed, the nearest friendly soil lay thousands of miles away in Australia. And Major General Alexander van de Grift understood that reality as he studied his maps by lamplight, tracing the eastern boundary of his defenses where Colonel Clifton Cates, a veteran of Below Wood who understood defensive arithmetic better than most men alive, had anchored his regiment along Alligator Creek, a shallow, winding stream that offered the only natural barrier between the Japanese coastal trail and Henderson Field, and Cates had positioned roughly 3,000 Marines along the west bank. But his most important decision was to concentrate two 37mm guns not against imaginary tanks, but against a single 45-yard sandbar, where any Japanese assault would have to pass, gambling everything on the assumption that Ichiki would mass his men and charge directly forward, because if he did, the crossing would become a slaughterhouse. Throughout August 20th, Pomeroy and his crew deepened their gun pit, adjusted sandbags, and rehearsed traverse drills until muscle memory replaced thought, stacking M2 canister rounds beside the breech, each thin-walled shell packed with steel balls 9 to 10 millimeters wide, designed to burst and fan outward in a lethal cone, and the math was unforgiving, because a man sprinting at full speed would need more than 10 seconds to cross 50 yards of open ground, while the steel balls would arrive in a fraction of a second, creating a zone where speed, bravery, and discipline meant nothing, and Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock reinforced that kill zone with interlocking water-cooled machine guns, mortars pre-registered on assembly areas, artillery batteries laid on likely approach routes, and forward observers ready to call fire within minutes. All while ignoring doctrine that said the 37mm was not meant for infantry, because doctrine mattered less than terrain, and terrain demanded slaughter. As night deepened, Solomon Islander scouts and marine listening posts reported a large Japanese force advancing from Taivu Point, fresh troops with clean uniforms and confidence forged by years of victory, and when Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza staggered back into the perimeter after being captured, tortured, and nearly killed, refusing to reveal marine positions, his warning confirmed what the commanders already knew: that Ichiki was coming, and he would attack before dawn, and across the creek. Ichiki prepared his men with unwavering faith in the doctrine that had carried Japan across Asia, dismissing concerns raised by officers like Captain Tetsuro Sawada, a veteran of Namenhen who had seen modern firepower annihilate brave men in open ground, because Ichiki believed speed, shock, and spiritual superiority would carry the night, and when the first preparatory fires began after midnight, machine guns chattered and grenade dischargers thumped as Japanese troops moved toward the sandbar. In disciplined formation, convinced that the Americans would break. At 1:38 a.m., the Marines opened fire, and the world exploded into violence as Browning machine guns hammered the crossing and Pomeroy rammed the first canister round home, firing into the dark, the shell bursting and releasing its steel storm across the lead ranks of the assault, men falling not one by one but in clusters, entire squads erased in an instant, and before the echoes faded, Pomeroy loaded and fired again. And again, each shot adding another invisible wall of metal to the corridor, turning the sandbar into a place where the air itself seemed solid, and those Japanese soldiers who survived the first volleys ran headlong into a reality no training could prepare them for, a place where bravery had no countermeasure, and although a handful reached the west bank and fought savagely with grenades and bayonets, they were isolated, overwhelmed, and destroyed, and when Ichiki ordered a second assault, convinced that more men would succeed where fewer had failed, the guns simply fired again, overlapping cones of steel sweeping the crossing clean, until by 3 in the morning, hundreds of bodies lay piled along the sand and Ichiki's regiment was bleeding itself to death against an unbroken line. As dawn approached, the shattered remnants of the assault pulled back into the coconut grove east of the creek, trapped between water and American guns, and when daylight revealed the carnage, artillery began falling among the palms, followed by infantry crossing upstream to complete the encirclement, and later, tanks rolled forward, their own 37mm guns firing canister at point-blank range into foxholes where Japanese soldiers waited to die, because surrender was unthinkable, and by late afternoon, organized resistance collapsed, Colonel Ichiki was dead, and of the 917 men who had marched so confidently toward Henderson Field, fewer than 50 escaped, while Marine losses numbered fewer than 50 killed, and the arithmetic of modern war had written its verdict in blood. In the days that followed, Japanese headquarters struggled to comprehend how an elite regiment had been annihilated in less than 24 hours, forced to confront the reality that spiritual doctrine could not overcome industrial firepower properly employed, while within the Marine Corps, Alligator Creek became a case study in adaptation, proof that imagination and mathematics could turn obsolete weapons into decisive tools, and for Frank Pomeroy, the memory of loading canister rounds into a gun never meant to fire at men remained vivid for the rest of his life, because on that night, across 50 yards of coral sand, the Pacific War changed, and the myth of imperial invincibility died under a rain of steel balls traveling faster than courage could follow.